My thoughts on Beyonce and the Buffalo Soldiers, really the Buffalo Soldiers. I don't believe that the indigenous people have a foundation to stand on with being angry at the Buffalo Soldiers. When in fact, when in fact it was the indigenous who betray Black Americans not once, not twice, but multiple times prior to the Buffalo Soldiers. And they betray Black Americans to align with white colonialism and white supremacy and oppression. That's what they aligned with. Now I can go all the way back to 1526 when around in the area where I live, okay, um, some indigenous came in contact with African enslaved that were brought here by the Spanish. Okay, that was in 1526. And the enslaved African people set fire, which is why it never took. The settlement never took. Okay, and then they went off to live with the indigenous. Okay, and back then there was no blood quantum. Okay, I know a lot of indigenous today like to talk about blood quantum, but back then there was no blood quantum, and this is another way of betrayal when it comes to indigenous and Black Americans, because back then, and most indigenous should know this, they did not decide who was in their tribes based off of blood quantum. That wasn't a thing. So um, African enslaved went and escaped to this is way back in the 1500s, um, to Native American tribes and became a part of the Native American tribes and fought alongside and lived with and intermarried with. Okay. And this is why you may see a 1% or 2% in some people. Okay. Now, since we want to talk about the blood quantum now, but they were just as included in the indigenous tribes as any other quote unquote blood indigenous, because that the blood quantum, that was not a rule to be a part of a tribe. It was just not a rule. Simple as that. Not until the Europeans came. So that's one betrayal, because at that blood quantum stuff or whatever, okay, even though it happened way after, they started trying to take away land and take away rights, tribal rights and everything from Black Americans. Now, let's get on back to the 1700s. The white people convinced the five civilized tribes, and y'all know those names, the five civilized tribes, to enslave Black people for their benefit. So, yeah, that was a deal they made with Europeans. Again, another betrayal. And that's documented right now. That's documented, well documented what happened. Instead of aligning with those Black Americans who stood with them, they decided we're going to align with oppression, the oppression of the Black people who stood with us, okay, and who we adopted in our tribes for centuries. And so now we're up to the Civil War. And this is where we run into the Buffalo Soldier, okay? This is where we're going to run into the Buffalo Soldiers who were doing their job, okay? Now at this point, tribes had already started their slavery with people who against Black Americans who were supposed to have been their allies all this time. They were starting to strip land, strip freedoms from them and everything else, okay? Just so they could align with who? All this stuff had already happened for centuries, for centuries. And now here's the Buffalo Soldiers in the 1800s. The indigenous had already cut ties with Black America. But see, here's what the indigenous did not know was that that's how white folks move. They tricked y'all. They tricked y'all. So while the indigenous were cutting ties with Black Americans left and right and doing all this other stuff, the white folks already knew they wanted to take y'all land from y'all. And some of the strongest and fiercest fighters here are Black Americans. the Buffalo Soldiers, and they were already enlisted in the military. They were doing their job. It wasn't because they hated anybody. It was they was doing their job. Now here's the difference. The indigenous weren't doing their job. They didn't have to align with oppression against African Americans. They didn't have to align with oppression. They chose to. They didn't have to take the land that Black Americans owned back and cut them from tribes and everything. They chose to because they wanted to have gained favor with white people. And that's just the truth. They thought that was the best survival they thought that was the best survival method. But that wasn't the best survival method. They chose wrong. What the Buffalo Soldiers were doing was their job. So instead of turning your anger toward the Buffalo Soldiers and Black Americans, you should actually go learn history and find out just how many times the indigenous betray Black America. Because Black America is very loyal. Now, it would have been far more fair if we can go back in time, right? The indigenous, the indigenous chiefs and all of them, right? They would look back and they would say, you know what? We messed up. We messed up. Because we should have continued our alliance with Black America so that we could provide a stronger front against white supremacy. That's what they would say. But instead, we did the opposite. And just like today, with even the election, the 2024 vote, you're doing the opposite. You're doing the opposite. This has caused the loss of your land, and then you want to spin it back and blame Black America. No, no. If you look back in time, spin it back, and look at it honestly. Spin it back. You chose to align with those who are stealing your land. And it's all because you wanted to take the land that was Black America's because you had adopted them into your tribe. You want to take the land that belonged to Black America back and allow white people to have it. And that's simply the truth. It's just like with the election. A lot of indigenous voted for this administration. A lot. As if y'all aren't teaching oral history properly, or y'all aren't telling the history actually properly. It's slanted. But no, Black people were very loyal. The multiple betrayals happened all the way through for centuries. And that was then the Buffalo Soldiers came up. And when they decide to do their jobs, y'all get mad at the Buffalo Soldiers instead of getting angry at the indigenous forefathers who continued to side with white supremacy against Black Americans who were very loyal and fought with the indigenous. Those are my thoughts on the Buffalo Soldiers. Black America did not oppress you. You oppressed Black America.